Hello, I'm Anne Margaret Smith, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you today about a topic which I feel is one of the most important issues that teachers are tackling today. It's great that your teaching organisation, LISM, has decided to hold a conference about inclusive practices and specifically inclusive assessment, because I feel that this is an area of inclusive practice which is sometimes neglected. And I should say that it's a topic which is really close to my heart because, as well as being an English language teacher, I am also a dyslexia assessor and a dyslexia specialist tutor. And I very often find that during the term I'm working hard with my students, they're working hard, they're doing well in the classroom, but when it comes to the assessment, they just don't seem to demonstrate how much they've learnt. Assessments just don't seem to work for many neurodiverse students. Neurodiversity for me means dyslexic, dyspraxic, students with ADHD, students on the autism spectrum. Assessments just don't seem to be set up to enable those students to show the progress that they've made, and that to me is a travesty. It's really unfair, and in some ways you sort of think all the hard work we put in goes to nothing if they can't get over that hurdle. So brilliant that we're here today talking about inclusive practices in assessment. Now, I need to be honest with you and tell you that I'm not 100% familiar with the context in which you're teaching. I have been talking to people about the systems that you're working within, and over the last few years I have been talking to teachers actually all around the world, and the same kinds of issues seem to come up. So, whilst I can't promise to give you specific solutions to the actual problems that you are facing, what I'm hoping to do in this talk is to lay out some principles and give you time to think about how you might adapt those principles for your practice. So, I've called my talk today Towards More Inclusive Assessment, acknowledging that it's not something we can solve overnight, it's a process that we're all working through. So what I'm going to do to start with is just unpack some of these terms. So apologies if I seem to be telling you things which are really obvious to you, but I think it's important that we just set out where we're starting from so that we can move forward through the next 45 minutes together. So, inclusive practices in ELT. It's quite a broad range of things, but generally speaking, I would say these are the ways that we, teachers, find to embrace the diversity in any group of learners. And every group of learners is diverse. There's no such thing as an homogeneous group. Even if all your students are the same age, from similar home backgrounds, same language backgrounds, you will get to know them and you will find out how different they are. You know what I'm talking about in terms of personality, in terms of aspiration, in terms of the way they learn, and of course not forgetting those students who learn in a different way. So dyslexic learners, dyspraxic learners, students with ADHD, students who are further along the autism spectrum, those with sensory impairments, physical disabilities. They're all different in their own ways. And what we have, in fact, in any group is quite a diverse set of individuals that we have to get to know and work out how best to work with them. We need to value the contribution that they all make. I mean, explicitly value it, and every time they give us something, we thank them and try and work out how that fits into what we're talking about. And we need to continuously work towards making the curriculum more accessible to all and representative of all. That, in a nutshell, is inclusive practice in ELT. So inclusion generally, it's a process, as I've said. It's not something that you can just bring in a box to the classroom, unpack it, and there you've got an inclusive classroom. It's what we're doing. We're always striving to move forwards towards a more inclusive way of working. It's dynamic, so we're always having to respond to the learners in our class. and also external pressures. I mean, this year there's been a very good example of how we constantly have to adapt our practice. We have to think about accessibility. So can the students actually see the materials? Can they access the materials? And representation. Do they see themselves in the materials? Do they feel that they are represented in the material that we're asking them to use? Inclusion is about social justice. It's about giving everybody the same opportunities. And some people might need more support to access those opportunities. And most of all, inclusion is a responsibility that we all share. Now, those of you who have signed up for the conference today, obviously you feel that sense of responsibility. And I do very often find myself talking to teachers who feel the same as me, that inclusive teaching is something that we all need to do. Now, in terms of teaching and assessment, I always think of them as actually two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. And although a lot of talk is about what we do in the classroom and how we can include students when we're teaching, and a lot of the investment is on that, actually, if we don't also think about how we assess our students, there's really very little point, because when they come to do an assessment, they're going to find themselves massively disadvantaged unless we've thought about assessment at the same time that we were thinking about teaching. And I do recognise that therein lies a huge challenge for teachers, because very often we are not in charge of the formal assessment process. Our job is to teach and to some extent to prepare our students for assessment, but we don't always get to set those assessments or manage them or run them or have any input into their development. I'll come back to that later in the talk, but it is a kind of gap there that we have between what we do in the classroom and what students have to face when they come to do their formal assessment. And I just want to try and address that a little bit today. Before I do, I just want to talk a little bit about the term assessment. Assessment, again, is a very broad term, and I think it's important to recognise there are different purposes of assessment. So we can talk about formative assessment, assessment for learning, which will keep feeding into our teaching. So we evaluate what our students have got, and we think about what our next steps would be. And this can be ongoing, it can be quite informal. It's very often classroom based. Sometimes teachers have control of that, so we get to set how that's done. Not always, but there may be situations where we do have a say in how that formative assessment happens. And on the other side, of course, we have summative assessment, which is maybe at the end of a course, at the end of a year. It's the assessment of learning. It's like a snapshot in time. It's what can that student do on that day, in that context, in that situation. And usually it's quite a stressful situation. It's quite formal, very often externally set, very often externally sat, so that students actually go out of the classroom to another place, which can be quite intimidating, quite daunting for some students. So I'm going to talk about these two different purposes of assessment, formative and summative. Now I have kind of simplified it quite a lot, I've boiled it down just to two types of assessment, and of course that's not reality at all. But for the purposes of this short talk, I think that's one way of going about it. But let's, for the moment, think about assessment generally and think about what the challenges are for our students. If you're working with dyslexic students, which I do mostly, you will notice that their memories are not always reliable on a day-to-day basis. And when it comes to assessment, that is a huge disadvantage for them, because they just cannot retrieve the information that they're being asked to demonstrate. I think that's true of many students in that stressful assessment situation, but particularly for neurodiverse learners. I do find that My dyslexic students often work more slowly. They need more time to complete tasks. So that's a huge disadvantage, particularly in timed assessments. And also in terms of how they interpret questions, I find that there is an infinite variety of interpretations of even the most simple instruction and what you might think is the clearest of questions. There'll be somebody in the class who will understand it in a very different way and answer that question in a way that you didn't expect. Now, in terms of assessment situation, of course, there's a lot of stress around this. And I think we'd all agree that when we get stressed, our memories are even less reliable. Sometimes it slows us down because we're worried and we're checking our work more to make sure that it's correct. And our understanding of what people are saying to us or asking us for could be quite different. So stress exacerbates all of these challenges for students, particularly neurodiverse students, but for all students. So stress is something that we really need to take into account in terms of helping students with the assessment process and in terms of making assessment more inclusive. So let's go back to these two different purposes of assessment and think first of all about formative assessment. In an ideal world, formative assessment would look a bit like this if it was really inclusive. It would be low stress, so it would be ongoing reviews and evaluations, minimum time pressure, maximum support. And the support doesn't always have to come from the teacher, remember. It could be peer evaluation, it could be two students working together or groups of students working together to evaluate what they know. It could be in the form of a quiz. It could be the think, pair, share activities where you put out a question to the class, you give them a minute or two just to think for themselves what they think their answer is. Then they can check with their nearest neighbour, see if they've got the same answer before they share more publicly. That reduces the stress, it gives them time to think, it gives them support. So formative assessment could look like that. The materials ideally would be accessible, so teachers would produce either written or recorded materials for the students, knowing them, so personalising it for those students and offering clarification as much as necessary. And ideally, students would have the opportunity to respond in whichever format they felt was best. So students could choose to make a poster, to answer with bullet points, to give an oral response rather than writing an essay. To give students the choice of how they respond would ideally be the best way of evaluating what they already know, so that we can move on to new material, or we can go back to recap again and to really secure the material that we want them to have. That's an ideal world. And what 2020 has taught us is that very often this world is not ideal. So your first task is to take a few minutes and think about how formative assessment happens in your classroom. How inclusive is that process? What challenges do you see your students facing? How could we support them to overcome those challenges? So I'm going to give you 5 minutes now. Have a little think. Talk to your neighbours if you would like to. After 5 minutes, I'll be back. Sorry to interrupt your conversations. I wish I could be there actually to listen in and see what kinds of things you're talking about. Sadly, that's not to be this time. But I hope you had a good conversation about the kinds of challenges that your students experienced in terms of formative assessment, and maybe you had some ideas about how you could support them as well. I'm going to offer you a couple of suggestions now. So you probably remember this diagram that I talked about before, and some of the key challenges. So what we can actually do as teachers to support our learners going into that formative assessment, maybe it's an end of week quiz, or maybe it is an end of term assessment that's formative rather than summative. One of the things we can do, of course, is to support them with their memory and help them develop better memory strategies. And also, in terms of managing the stress, helping students to find strategies to minimize that stress and look after themselves, basically. This is a massive issue that we're seeing in all kinds of situations, young people suffering from mental health conditions. If we can start, and it doesn't matter how young your learners are, if we can start them really young, thinking about what's causing anxiety and how they can minimize the effects, we're going to be doing them a massive favour, and not just in terms of their learning, but in terms of their life generally. So definitely recommend that. So let me just give you some ideas of what I'm talking about here. These are things which we can build into the curriculum. They're not sort of extras, or they're not something that we do once and then it's done. It's something that we maybe incorporate into our teaching as part of our ongoing curriculum. So this diagram sort of shows you, yeah, there's a test day which is coming up, but all the way through the course leading up to that, we're going to be working on how we can remember more, how we can look after ourselves. In terms of memory strategies, we're really encouraging students to do anything which is multisensory, so anything which incorporates both looking and listening, possibly something tactile as well. Repetition is the name of the game when it comes to memory. Repetition can be boring, but there are ways that we can make it more interesting. Anything that's novel, so it's something they haven't done before, anything that's fun, they're going to be keen to do it, and they will keep repeating it. So it could be a game, it could be a song. They'll keep repeating it, and they will thank you for introducing them to ways of repeating in a fun way. And anything that makes connections with what they already know is going to be really useful for them in terms of retrieving information, even in stressful situations like exam situations. So we're talking about things like memory pictures, where students perhaps draw a little picture which reminds them of a word, or it reminds them of a sound in the word. Anything that they can make a connection, what they already know and what they have to learn, and get it together into an image. They don't have to be brilliant artists. It's the process that they're going through that's important there. The same with visualization. If they can visualize what a word looks like, or visualize something that reminds them of the word, that can be really, really important. I mentioned songs. I often get my students to take the new words that they've learned and put them to the tune of a song that they know really well. Quite often in my class I use Happy Birthday, because that's a song that students from almost every country are familiar with. But there may be a song that your students like, and it's only important that they're familiar with the tune, and then they can put in the new words that they've learnt. They keep singing it, they keep repeating the words. Similarly, using music to encourage repetition of spelling. I mean, spelling is something that's quite challenging in English, and just getting students to repeat the letters in the sequence is a little bit dull. But if you put a rhythm behind it and get them to chant the word, the letters in the word, or even to make up a dance routine for a particular word, they're going to remember that. And then there are things like vocabulary cards, where you have just a small piece of card. On one side you have the target word, and on the other side they can write their own word in their own language, or they can draw a picture to remind them. And that's something they can just flick through quite quickly. For those students who would prefer not to write, they can record it on their phone or other recording device and just listen back to their own voice saying these words again and again. These are quite effective ways of encouraging students to remember the new information. Moving on to talk about self-care. I don't know how much of this work you do with your students, but certainly teaching languages is a great opportunity to get them talking about eating food, what they like, what's good for them, what's not good for them, and sleeping as well. How much do they sleep? What time do they go to bed? Do they use their screens all the way up until the time that they actually go to sleep? Talking about ways that we can maintain general well-being, I think, is important. But in terms of stress control, this is something that I think is talked about less, and yet is really, really important. And again, we can talk about, you know, if you're eating well, if you're sleeping well, maybe you're doing some exercise during the day, you're going to feel calmer, less stressed, you know, everything is going to work better. But there are situations when we do get stressed, and then helping students to recognize the signs, recognize the kind of onset of anxiety, so that they can start quite early to combat it, I think is really important, and give them strategies to combat it. So breathing techniques, getting them just to focus on their breathing. Breathe in for 3 and out for 3, and just getting them to practice that and to know that that is something which will calm them down. Or massaging hands and face can be quite helpful for some students. Grounding techniques are often used for students who are experiencing panic attacks, and we hope that it won't get to that stage with your students. But if they start to realise that they're becoming anxious, or even panic is setting in, a grounding technique can be really, really helpful. Let me just show you a couple of examples of this. If the person just sits down and just focuses on 5 things that they can see, 4 things that they can hear, 3 things that they can smell, 2 things that they can feel, and 1 thing that they can taste. If they've got somebody helping them to go through that sequence, that's really, really helpful. That's not always possible. So I'm just going to show you a very simple example. In fact, we could try this together. Unfortunately, you won't be able to tell me what you're thinking, but just think it to yourself, or share it with a neighbour if you like. So a very simple version of this. If you close your eyes and just think about, what can you hear? And what can you feel? So I don't know if you could hear what's going on around here. For example, there's a clock ticking, there's some traffic on the road outside. There are some seagulls, obviously hungry, looking for food here. And in terms of what I could feel the carpet under my feet and the smooth top that my laptop is resting on. Just focusing on the here and now, just even for a couple of seconds, can be really helpful for students, just to calm them down, to ground them. And as I say, it's quite a simple technique. You can teach your students to do this. They can do it themselves and take control of that stress. So 2 strategies which we can build in to our language teaching, which will help students with assessment and actually help them in all aspects of their lives. And I think later in life they will thank you for that. So let's move on now to think about summative assessment. And summative assessment is actually, in many ways, a lot more stressful. It can be high stakes. It can make the difference between which school you go on to, which university you go on to. If you're working with older learners, it might make a difference about what kind of job you can get. There's a lot of stress associated with summative assessment. In terms of what we can do as teachers, I will be making some suggestions, but first I'd just like to think about, in an ideal world, what would summative assessment look like? Inclusive summative assessment would be flexible in the timing, so students can work at their own pace to complete the exam, and they would have a flexible schedule, so they take the exam when they're ready to take the exam. And I think a lot of pressure comes from education systems, like we have in the UK, where all the students have to move at the same pace and everybody is expected to get to the goal at the same time. For many students, that's not realistic and it's not helpful, but that is how our education system works. If we had more flexible scheduling, students could work until they're ready to take the exam and then move on at their own pace. In terms of exam design, it would be lovely if all exams were designed to be accessible. So in terms of layout and in terms of format, and also have representation built in so that all students, when they open their exam paper, they see the situations that reflect their own lives. They can relate to the exam material. We're not living in an ideal world, as I've said, but what I'd like you to do is to take 5 minutes again and think about how inclusive the summative assessments are that your students have to take. Now, as I said at the beginning, I'm not really familiar with the kind of exams that your students have to take, but you're the experts in this. So just take a few minutes, chat to your neighbours and think about what are the barriers, what are the challenges that your students come up against? How could we support them? And I'll be back in 5 minutes. So, again, sorry to stop your conversations. And again, I really wish I could listen in to what you were saying. But I have a few suggestions to make, and so I'll start with that. So, just to recap, you remember that when I was talking about formative assessment, I suggested that helping students develop memory strategies and also self-care strategies to minimize stress are two really good starting points. In terms of supporting students with summative assessment, where the stakes can be higher and the stress levels higher, again, similar sorts of things that we can do. Plus, for example, putting exam access arrangements in place wherever possible. As well as memory strategies, we can help students develop specific revision techniques and exam technique, because I think we all know that passing exams is not just about how much you know, it's about how you play the game. So we can help students to become smarter exam takers. And for some students, that can make the difference between being able to demonstrate what they know and not, and basically success in a formal exam and having to keep retaking the exam. So these things are worth thinking about, and I'll just run through quickly some suggestions of how it might work. In terms of the timeline, I would say as soon as students are entered for formal exams, we should be thinking about which students need access arrangements. Memory strategies, revision techniques can go along side by side, and as we get closer to exam day, then would we start looking at exam technique. So access arrangements, it could be anything from extra time to actually having somebody reading the questions for the student or even recording their answers. There are so many different exam access arrangements which are permissible in different situations. I would say there are 4 main steps that I usually go through. The first thing is discuss with the student what they think would be most useful for them. I've had many students for whom the default has been, oh, they get extra time. That doesn't help every student. It really doesn't. If they can't read the exam paper, they can sit there all day and it still won't help them. So extra time is not the answer for everybody. If you need evidence, make sure you've got that evidence. That might mean that the student has to have a formal assessment or a formal identification of whatever particular difficulty they're experiencing. But as I said before, contact the exam board well in advance to put in your request for the arrangements that you think are best. And don't take no. I mean, within reason. But very often exam boards will say, oh no, we don't normally do that. Why not? This is what the student needs in order to demonstrate their level of understanding and how much they've learned. And we can make a very good case with legislation behind us. There's equality legislation which will support us in this. So I'll say, don't take no for an answer. What I mean is, keep pushing, keep pushing. I'll come back to this a little bit later in the talk. But remember that exam access arrangements are just a sticking plaster. They are supposed to level out the playing field so that all students are able to access the exam, you know, at the same level. They work to some extent, but there's still more that we can do. For example, really supporting students with their revision techniques. And so many students say to me, coming up to exams, they say, I've been reading my notes and I've been reading my notes. That's a good start, but it's not enough. You've got to process that information. You've got to convert the text into different formats. Discuss with your classmates. Some students learn best by actually discussing and verbalizing what they're thinking, and that will help them to remember. And making connections across topics too. They might understand how a word or a verb or a construct works in one particular subject area more than in a different domain. So making the connections can really help that. And practicing the kinds of tasks that they're going to have to do and learning how to approach different types of question that they're going to come across in the exam, which leads me on to exam technique. And this is what it's all about. Knowing what is going to be in the exam, knowing what is expected, how long you have, how many questions. If you have a choice of questions, which are the best ones to choose? And I always recommend to my students that they set out a plan, the timing, how much time are they going to spend? And I try and get them to read all the questions first, but they don't always do that. But if they understand the questions and understand what they're being asked to do, so if it's a gap fill, is it just one word in each gap? If it's a reading comprehension, are they going to have to write out a full sentence, or can they just put in one word answer? Or, you know, what are they going to have to do? Make sure that they understand the requirements of the exam. And then also teach them about cherry picking, which is a technique one of my students perfected. If she had 10 questions in the exam, she didn't have time to do all 10 questions. So she would pick the ones that she would get most marks on. And she was a very successful exam taker, I have to say. So cherry picking, getting them to think about which questions will they start with, which questions will they move on to, you know, if they've got time to carry on. Self-prompting is little ways in which they can support themselves during the exam. Sometimes students get really stressed and everything goes out of their head. So some of my students, for example, will go into the exam and immediately write down something that they are afraid they will forget, past tense, irregular forms, or whatever it is. So they've got that on a piece of paper, piece of scrap paper, if your students are allowed to have that in the exam. And then they don't need to worry about forgetting it because they've got it there. So little ways that students can help themselves in the exam, reduce some of the uncertainty and reduce some of the stress. That's what makes a good exam taker, I believe. Something we can help students with. So quite a lot of different strategies there that we've talked about. I would just like to give you a few minutes now to chat to your neighbours and think about whether any of these techniques could be useful for you in your context. Maybe with a bit of adaptation to suit you, to suit your learners, whom I don't know, of course. And also, is there anything else that we could do as teachers? Sorry to interrupt you. I hope that you have had a useful chat with your neighbours and that you could see yourselves maybe using some of these techniques, maybe adapting them to make them more suitable for your context. So in terms of what else we can do as teachers to move towards more inclusive assessment, I think it's important to recognise our role in the education system, that we sit right in the heart of our education system. Obviously, we work most closely with the students. We work with them on a daily basis, many of us, and we can support them directly, but we can also get their families on board, and we can maybe offer strategies to the families to support the students as well, whether that's emotional support or practical support in terms of revision techniques, getting organised, applying for exam access arrangements, getting the evidence together, all of that sort of thing. Get the families on board. And as a unit, we three, so teachers, students, families, can achieve a lot. But we mustn't forget that the education system is much bigger than that. We're part of a much bigger system, which includes, for example, management. So maybe we can feed up to our managers and we can tell our managers what we would like to see, particularly in terms of formative assessment. If it's internal within our organisation, within our school, we can tell managers what we would like to see and why. And there's a lot of evidence, a lot of research-based evidence out there to support a more inclusive model. We can also talk to publishers. If you feel that your coursebook doesn't really offer enough ongoing evaluation, write to them and ask them why. Remember that as a teacher, you are a valued customer and your views matter to the publishers, because if you tell your managers, actually this book's rubbish, we don't want to use this book anymore, the publishers are going to feel it. So don't forget your role, your power as a consumer. The same is true to some extent to exam boards. If you are preparing students for external exams, international exams like the Cambridge Suite or Trinity exams, don't forget that the exam boards value your custom, and if there's something that one of your students needs, tell them. And I do think that exam boards, many of them want to accommodate, they want to be seen as inclusive, but maybe they just need a bit of help, they need a bit of encouragement. So that could be something that teachers could do. And teachers' associations particularly, the more of us get together, the louder our voice can be. And if you're preparing students for exams which are not set by exam boards, but by your local policymakers, the same is true. As teachers, you might think, I'm just a teacher, what do I know? You're a teacher, you know the students, you know what they need, and you can see the gap between what's happening in the classrooms where you are working inclusively and what is happening when they come to assessment, when the assessments are really not very inclusive. So you can see that gap. It may be that policymakers with the best will in the world are not aware of the issues. Help them to understand. That's my advice for all teachers. Do not underestimate your power, particularly when you work together as a group. So if you would like to know more about inclusive practices, whether in the classroom or indeed in terms of assessment, there is a lot of information available. And with my IATEFL hat on, I would love you to visit our website. I'm the coordinator of the IATEFL Inclusive Practices and SEN SIG. We are a group set up to provide information and resources to teachers who would like to work in a more inclusive way. Annette Igel is there with you today, if you're there on the 9th of September. So if you would like to chat to her, I'm sure she will be very happy to talk to you about the work we do and how you could get in touch, how you could get involved. If you have any questions, I'm going to be joining you, technology allowing, and you'll be able to put your questions directly to me live on screen. but I'd just like to thank you very much for listening to me today, and thank you for your interest in working towards more inclusive assessment in language teaching.